B is rolling.
Sound, speed, all yours.
Richard Murphet, thank you for joining me for this conversation.
Hi, Matt. Thank you for asking me along.
And congratulations on your new book, Acts of Resistance in Late Modernist Theatre, Writing and Directing in Contemporary Theatre Practice. I've so enjoyed reading it over the past few months. So The Darkening Sky, your new play, primarily dissects memory. So I just wanted to start with a few of your memories. Where did you grow up?
Born in London, just after the end of the Second World War, while the planes were still landing. Grew up in Canberra until about the age of 12, and then from teenage years onwards, apart from a few years living overseas in my adult life, I've been a resident of Melbourne.
And what is your earliest memory?
Drawing on a blackboard in chalk a huge tree with my best friend Willie Nupkus. This is the age of 4 or 5. And we were very proud of the result at the end, and the teacher liked it.
So it was at school?
This was at school. And so it was my first act of collaborative art making. And it got good reception.
Yeah, good reviews.
Good reviews.
At that point in your life, what did you want to be when you grew up?
At that point in my life, I have no idea, probably something like a fireman or God knows what. But my big passion in the later years, like from probably 7, 8 onwards, was to be a journalist. My father was a journalist, and I came from a split family, and so I used to go up on my own up to Sydney where he lived and visit him, and he would take me to the journalist club in Sydney, and it was so romantic and so full of atmosphere, and there were people there smoking cigarettes and talking about world politics, and I thought that'd be the life for me.
So what is your first memory connected to the theatre?
A school concert in primary school, an outdoor performance space, and me doing a speech of Puck's on the performance space and trying to be spry and kind of, playful like Puck. And at the end of the speech, jumping off this outdoor performance space and breaking my ankle.
My first thing that I ever did was a Puck monologue.
Oh, there you go.
Wow, I didn't break my ankle though.
Oh, good.
And so that was at school. Where did you, with tertiary education, where did you train? Where did you study?
I studied at Monash. I did an arts degree at Monash. One of the first years that Monash started, like not long after Monash began. Majoring in English. I did honours in English, and then I got a Commonwealth Scholarship and I went over to Toronto and I did a master's degree in drama or theatre at Toronto University.
Right. So did you know that whole time that you wanted to work in theatre?
Well, it was becoming more obvious. I was spending a lot of time on what is still called the Monash Players, which is the student theatre company at Monash, and I was one of the people who started that off, and I was performing and directing with them. So I specifically went over to Toronto in order to further my practice in that, and the course over there was interesting because it was mainly lectures in aspects of the history of theatre, but they gave us a very small studio space in order to be able to do what we liked. And so I just directed show after show after show there. It was a converted church or something like that.
That's really when you began working in theatre, was?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd acted at Monash, but when I really thought, okay, this is what I want to do with my life.
What did the scene feel like at that time?
Well, it was Vietnam War time. And so all the draft dodgers from America were coming up to Toronto. So it was very active in Canada, very active in Toronto. The music scene was fantastic. It was all, all the kind of Leonard Cohen, the band, Joni Mitchell, all those people were just operating, and groups coming up from America performing. So it was a very exciting time to be there. And after that, after being there, I went down and worked in New York for a while, lived in New York for a while, and that was exciting as well. So yeah, I was lucky with my timing.
When did you start working in theatre here?
Well, when I came back, I started teaching theatre, acting, making performance at a place called Monash Teachers College, which then became Rusden. And I mean, from then on, I was making theatre at the same time as I was teaching practice. And a lot of my making, and all the way through my life, a lot of my most interesting work has been made with students. Because you've got the freedom there to have a large group of people and to be able to make what you dream, and people go along with you and they take you somewhere else. And so it's fantastic. You haven't got the constraints of mainstream theatre, and I've never worked in mainstream theatre. I've kept deliberately away from mainstream theatre all my life. So it's either been working with students or working in the independent stream.
And in terms of working with students, I mean, you were a massive part of the VCA for a long time. What was your involvement with the VCA?
I started off teaching directors and writers and animateurs, performance makers. And then I went away after about 3 years and worked as the artistic director of the Mill Theatre Company in Geelong. And then I came back and I took over the degree there in directing and writing and performance making, and occasionally working within the acting stream as well, teaching improvisation and directing shows.
Well, there must be something about the VCA trained actor, because almost all of our cast are VCA graduates. Is there something different about a VCA actor?
Well, I like to think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I like working with people that I have seen work or have worked with. Not all the time, but that's my preference, out of just doing a general audition and not being able to work out from 5 minutes whether or not the person's going to work. When I've got a history of them, I like that. But also VCA actors, certainly through a particular period of the course, were trained to take responsibility for themselves out there in the space, to be autonomous. So not everything depends upon the director. They make really interesting offers, very good with language, very good physically. All those kind of things just fed into my aesthetic.
Well, talking about your aesthetic, let's talk about your new play. So you've captivated Australian audiences with your plays Quick Death and Slow Love, Dolores and the Department Store, The Inhabited Woman, The Inhabited Man, and now your latest work, The Darkening Sky. So what is The Darkening Sky about?
Early on, you talked about it as being about memory, and that's true, although I would call it as about being about the act of remembering. And that's a really difficult process for we as individuals, and yet we're haunted by it. Everyone is in the process of trying to remember their past and put it together with their present in order to be able to plan their future. We've got people teaching history in order to go back into the past of the culture. So the act of remembering is a really big one for our culture. So one of the things it's about is the act of remembering from two particular angles. It's always seemed to me that there are two ways of remembering, and both of them are faulty. And both of them are fallible. And one is an individual trying to remember their past and looking at old photographs and looking at old videos and remembering flashes of songs and flashes and bits of conversation. And from that, trying to reconstruct what their past was, like me talking about my earliest memory just a moment ago. And yet, a lot of that is constructed. To try and put that through into a narrative of my past is as much imaginative as it is truthful. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I fill out the gaps with some kind of fiction of what happened to me in my life. But sometimes it can be really difficult, traumatic. And it's very hard to try and refine memories. And the central character in this play is trying to find how to deal with two facts in his life, which is that two key women in his life disappeared. And how can he construct what happened there through trying to go through the associations of memory? So that's one form of memory. And the other one is the kind of remembering that detectives do, forensic memory, where they put together bits and pieces of clues, what they pick up from interviews, what they pick up from photographs, etc. And that is equally faulty and equally fallible. And the detective in this play, because we've got the two acts of remembering happening simultaneously in this play. And the detective in this play at one stage says, look, I've got the data, I've got the information, but I haven't got the story. And you can look at all those television series about detectives, and they're really exciting, but none of them can actually get to the truth of what really happened inside an incident that they're going back on. They can maybe get the perpetrator, but that's not the whole truth. So I'm interested in looking at the fallibility of memory and the way in which imaginatively we construct what might happen in the past in order to understand the present and proceed into the future. So that's one thing the play's about. And the other thing is that the two women who are attempting to be tracked down are two remarkable women. Both of them sacrificing their lives for the cause of political activity, and doing it in a way in which they have to weigh that against the losses in terms of family, in terms of love, that they are going to be having to handle. So they're the two sides of it, and the two women that both the detective and the narrator are trying to remember. We see them in the play, but we don't really find out what's happened to them. And I'm interested in the audience itself having to go through the tricky process of building a picture of what might have happened, like a jigsaw puzzle, without knowing what the end is ever.
And you are the writer and the director of the piece. In your book, you write about the experience of the auteur. In film, this term means a film director who influences their film so much they rank as their author. What does an auteur mean in the theatre?
Well, what I've argued in my book is that an auteur is a person who takes responsibility for the overall conceptual realisation of the play, from the point of writing it through to its embodiment on stage. And that person, male, female, might have designers who are helping them, who are working and bringing their particular input into it. But the overall conceptual drive comes from one person. So it's not like a director who's directing a show written by someone else. And it's not like a writer who's writing a show and then handing it over to a director. It's someone who's taking responsibility for both sides of the creative act.
Well, on that, you also write, the occupation of both roles, writer and director, by the one artist counterintuitively allows more separation between them than is the case for a traditional playwright who writes for the stage, or a traditional director who directs as the text commands. Has that been your experience working with the Darkening Sky?
Well, the word allows is really important there, I think. It isn't always the case that there can be that kind of separation. But it is my experience in the Darkening Sky that the act of writing it was something entire unto itself, and I wasn't thinking about the presentation of that on stage as I was writing it. And now in the act of directing it, I'm trying to keep away from whatever I might have imagined when I was writing it, and to say, okay, what does this allow? And I've got a lot of really good people who are influencing me in this. All the performers and all of the designers bring their bit into it. And that keeps changing my concept of what it was that I was writing about. So that's what I mean by a kind of separation. I don't have to be truthful to the letter of the play like some directors feel they might, although recent directors no longer have that responsibility. And I'm not sitting there as a writer chewing at my nails to see whether or not the director's going to bugger it up. Yeah, I'm keeping both in balance.
Yeah. And so with the production, what can people expect to see? What is the guiding aesthetic of the design? What will it look like?
What we're trying to get at, both the set and costume design, the film design, the music design, is some world that is sitting between a remembered world and a palpable reality, where out of a remembered world that is based upon an old style cafeteria bar emerges something that is real, that is happening on the stage. But all the time, this cafe, this bar hovers like a presence there that can't quite be put into the back of the brain, that can't be forgotten. And so I'm interested in that as the aesthetic, how to establish on stage a dual reality that is going on.
Mm. And you're taking inspiration from a particular artist, visual artist, Edward Hopper. Can you talk us through why Edward Hopper? What about that painting of a bar that you've used as inspiration, as well as his other paintings? What is it about him?
Well, he fulfills exactly what I'm talking about. He's a figurative artist, so you could look at any one of his paintings on the surface and think it's a truthful representation of a woman sitting in a bar on her own, having a cup of coffee, or a whole group of people gathered around a bar while the barman serves them, and all those wonderful images that he's got. But of course, they aren't quite that. They hover. They are mythic. They have the feeling of memory about them, even as you look at them. And so they escape from being just about one particular time that he was viewing a bar, and they become something far more. They linger in the consciousness of the culture much more. And I've always loved that about his work, the colours that he uses, the slightly blurred representation of the figures, the fact that they are so kind of isolated, sitting within a darkness with a light on a particular bar table. All of those things are what we're trying to get at in the aesthetic of the play. And Hopper's he wasn't what I began with in my mind. I began something completely different, but after talking to my designer, Ellie Kent, we came up with this particular very, very iconic painting of a couple sitting at a bar while a barman serves them. And it's a beautiful painting, and it's been used in advertising by Coca-Cola, it's been used in films, it's been reinvented by other painters. It's become part of our cultural memory.
And working with a visual stimulus like that, or taking inspiration from a visual artist, I think it's worth talking about framing. You make particular mention of this in your book and on your chapter where you are analysing Jenny Kemp's creative process. A key artistic ingredient she uses is visual artwork, and she talks about the importance of framing a picture, framing the stage, framing a moment, framing a person. So with that in mind, what is the particular framing of this Hopper bar on stage? What would that do for our story?
It gives it a container. And I think that's the important thing about framing, that in theatre, especially in open stage theatre, there's a danger that a lot of the dramatic tension that's generated on stage can be leaked out to the wings, out to the front, can just disappear because it's got no particular visual focus. And what she's very conscious of, Jenny Kemp, because of her father's work, is her father was a visual artist, and so he was very aware of the edges of the frame of the painting, holding in all the energy that he is painting. He was an abstract painter, and so there's a lot of energy in his work, but it's held like a pressure cooker by the frame of the painting itself. And that's what she does with her plays, and what I've always tried to do with my plays. I'm very interested in working in an open stage, not in a framed stage, not in a proscenium arch, in an open stage, but one which the fiction, the play, the drama itself is contained by the frame of the set in some way. And so therefore the energy that's within the play builds up within that frame. And I think that happens conceptually as well as directly with this particular set, because it is held together by the memory of this bar at the same time as the shape of the bar holds together the action. And within that, we've got another frame, and the other frame is at the back wall of the bar. In a frame on the back wall of the bar, all the film work happens, which is another whole level of reality that is going on in the film at the same time as the physical action on stage.
Yeah, so you've engaged a young filmmaker to create film elements that will be present on stage. So you're no stranger to utilising elements of film in theatre. What will it bring to this particular show?
Oh, what goes on in a person's mind while they're in the act of trying to remember? What other associations come up from other times, from other places? You can't control that. It's the same with music. Like, I can't control when all of a sudden a phrase of a song comes up as I'm walking along the street for no particular reason from my past. And if I'm remembering something, other images flash into my mind that if I psychoanalyze them, would be able to be directly linked to what I'm trying to remember, but they feel like they are random and associative at first. So what Jak, the filmmaker, and I have been working on, we started off, and this was mainly my input, thinking of the film as being a kind of locating device. So we'd have a scene not in the bar, but in a street somewhere, but taking place in the bar, and we'd try and locate the street through the film. And then we did that, and we got really sick of that, and Jak got really sick of that. So now we've opened that up much more so that what's happening in the film is also flashes of memories forward in his life, back in his life, out into aspects of his life that never happen in the play at all, in order to try and get at the sense of the pieces that are being jigsawed together and what gets washed out from that in different directions as you're trying to remember.
In terms of using film in theatre, you've described theatre as a magpie art. Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah. Theatre of all the arts uses every other art. I mean, set design uses visual art. It uses dance is the basis of physical movement. It uses strong sense of language and literature. And now more and more with the use of film and the use of music being fed into that, theatre just voraciously eats it all and tries to find its own way of putting it together. And that's the danger of theatre. So something like music, I remember David Hare, the British playwright, saying years ago that if you start playing music that is going to be just there to create an emotion in the audience, then all you're doing is doing something that the play itself should do. And film does that a lot. It uses music just to create an emotional feeling, an emotional tension. So again, much like the filmmaker, the composer here is using music which doesn't work, which works against the text, which rhythmically suggests something else, so that we can give each art form its own reality, its own purpose within there, and we then push them together and see how they work together. Yeah.
So
And that's my role as a director, to be able to kind of go, oh my God, that's not going to work, or that is going to work, we can do more of that. And so the magpie form is a challenge, but also the most exciting thing about theatre at the moment.
And there's a lot of levels in the work, because you've got elements of film, you've got elements of live music, you've got different timelines going on, as well as different physical realities. So in terms of weaving all of that together, it reminds me of something I read in your book, where you're talking about the American avant-garde theatre maker Richard Foreman, and you highlight his resistance to covering what he calls the joins of the theatre. In other words, his resistance to a narrative illusion where an audience is expected to forget they're watching theatre. So in this piece, with so many joins, how are you going about collecting all of that together?
Well, I've got to say, to start off with, there is no one like Richard Foreman. Richard Foreman does this in a way that no other theatre artist that I know. Richard Foreman writes his own plays, directs them, visually designs them exactly himself, does all the music himself. He works in rehearsal with all of the operators around him for the entire rehearsal, so he can call up any music, any image that he wants. The actors are only part of this. So he's constantly in the act of trying to crowd the theatre out with lots of different input. And he's a genius at it. But all I can say in this one is that I want to be able to throw out the challenge to the audience to make of this particular experience what they can. There are some things that will slip past them. There are some things that will be mysteries, just as they are for me or for us. And there are some things that will suddenly flash clear in their own lives and maybe in the life of the person that I'm depicting. And for that to happen, if you reduce everything to a seamless narrative, you kind of know what the result's going to be even before you get there. You can guess what the next step is. And the really interesting series now on television are those where you're guessing for about half the whole series what on earth is going on. Now, I don't want this to be a confusion for people on the stage, and I don't think it will be, but I do want it to be a mystery for a lot of the time.
You write that in Quick Death, you seeked not to create a representation of epilepsy on stage, but rather to create an epileptic theatre. So the experience and the theatrical form are one and the same. What kind of theatrical experience are you seeking to create with your new play?
Well, I should say that particular statement about quick death came because I am an epileptic. I have been an epileptic, and at the time that I wrote, I was having fairly regular epileptic seizures. And so to write a story about a person who was having epileptic seizures wasn't something that was possible for me because I was in the middle of doing it myself. So the theatre I wanted to make had to have a form that was a bit like what I experienced as a seizure. So there were lots of blackouts, lots of short, sharp images that suddenly disappeared, etc., etc. And I think all of my theatre then has been influenced by that. And so partly what I'm trying to do is to keep another sense of the epileptic experience of theatre together. That is, that you don't follow something through until it has been resolved. You cut it off just before and you move to something else. So the audience is constantly having to shift. They go through an experience that is unnerving and disturbing. But particularly for this play, and we've covered this, like what I'm trying to do is to create a play which in its form is about the act of remembering.
Your central character is played by Brian Lipson. Have you worked with him before? How did he become involved?
Never worked with Brian before as an actor. I've seen him act in a lot of things. I've worked alongside him as a director. there was never any question in my mind that it had to be Brian that played this part. Brian, I don't know how to describe it, but he's got a wonderful combination of normality, mad humour, and soul. And I know that's a kind of a dangerous word to throw about, but it's something which is to do with a real feeling that what he is speaking comes from some deep emotional well inside him. He doesn't just do the role ever. Or when he does, it doesn't work for him as an actor. But when he's really firing, I'm always incredibly moved by it. And I feel like that's the case with this. So Brian is involved simply because I went and asked him, I've got this play, and he read it and loved it and said, yes, I'd like to be involved. End of story.
Richard, thank you.
Thanks, man. You didn't ask me why you were involved.
And why did you get the talented Neate?
Exactly.